Welcome to Reporter's Notebook as we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the situation in Ukraine continues. What is the state of the war effort with Russia invading and Ukraine trying to repel them?
So a good place to start is this past Monday was May 9th, which was Victory Day in Russia.
Right.
And so it's a day where they celebrate Russia's contributions in World War II to defeating the Nazis. And so it's a big day. They have a military parade, and U.S. officials and Western officials at large were concerned about what exactly Putin would say in this speech.
Right.
There were concerns he would talk about proclaiming victory in the war.
Sure.
They were concerned that he would mobilize additional troops and formally declare war, because we have to remember, while we view this obviously as a war in Ukraine, he is still referring to it to the Russian people as a military operation.
Right.
And so they're held in the dark about this. And so what we actually saw when he gave the speech was he did neither of those things. He didn't, declare victory. He didn't talk about taking more territory. Any of those things. What his speech was mostly about is about a 10-minute speech, and he focused a lot on NATO and what he described as NATO's fault in the situation.
Right.
And he placed blame at NATO and said they were coming too close to Russia's borders. He didn't want that, and so according to his justification of the war, they had to sort of beat back NATO.
So it was really more of a restatement of his long-held justification for the Russian invasion rather than an escalation.
Absolutely. And so people were concerned about the escalation. And then a lot of people expressed some curiosity as to why he didn't go further in his language. And a lot of people believe it actually has to do with what is actually happening in the war. As we know, Russia, at the beginning of the invasion in the end of February, they invaded with the intent to topple Kyiv, the capital, within a matter of days. And that's what the U.S. expected. That's what the Western world expected. And it couldn't have been further from what we saw. The Ukrainian resistance was much stronger than anyone expected. They were able to defend their capital, and they even pushed Russians out of the capital. The Russians then declared a second phase of their war where they transitioned and they're refocusing in the Donbas region, which is the contested territories in the eastern part of Ukraine, where fighting has been ongoing for roughly 8 years now.
Right.
And so with Russia refocusing on this region, it's unclear as to whether Russia will, if they're successful there, go back into Ukraine or just sort of call it quits there and take what they've got.
Right.
We heard earlier this week the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, was on Capitol Hill, and she said even the intelligence community isn't quite clear as to what Putin will do when this phase of the war ends. And she said there is concern that he could, if he is successful in the Donbas, which the Pentagon says they haven't been, that they could re-enter Ukraine further and try and go for Kyiv again, or go for just additional territory.
Now, it has to be a somewhat discouraging sign for Russia in that this is much more favorable ground, much more favorable territory for them. The Western aid that the Ukrainian government requested arrived a little later than they were hoping it would come, and yet still the Russians are having limited progress at best.
Exactly, and it comes down to a lot of the issues that the Russian military had in the beginning of this conflict are ongoing. We've heard from the Pentagon that they've seen indications that there's lagging morale within units. We've heard that there are some Russian soldiers who are actually refusing to carry out orders from their commanders. And that's in addition to the fact that the area that they're currently operating in is actually more conducive for them. One of the big struggles that they had as they were trying to topple the capital is that they were very far from their supply lines or from their resupply. So it took a while for them to get any additional supplies that they needed, whether it was food or even additional weapons. And so now that they're focused in the Donbas, it's actually much shorter for them to get these types of material and supplies because they've been in the Crimean Peninsula for 8 years now since they annexed that territory. And then the other question is, with Ukraine seemingly holding their own in the Donbas, a lot of people have started to speculate as to whether Ukraine could actually win the war.
Right.
And so this is not a conversation or a topic that people were discussing seriously a month ago or 2 months ago, but it really is a conversation that's being had more and more frequently. And a big question is, what does winning look like? And so it depends. The U.S. has been asked this question. A number of U.S. officials have, and they very often defer to their Ukrainian counterparts.
Right.
And we've heard different statements from members of the Ukrainian government about whether it's just, going back to the pre-war borders, or
Right.
even the possibility, even though a lot of people have said it's unlikely, of going back to pre-2014,
Right.
Where Ukraine would have control of Crimea.
Before the Russian annexation
Yes.
of Crimea. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, because a lot of Western assumptions and a lot of early Western aid was premised on the idea that the capital would fall quickly, and what we'd really be supporting was some kind of counterinsurgency. And now we're talking about maybe supporting the Ukrainians actually winning the war against Russia.
Absolutely. And it's important to note, we've seen the U.S. And President Biden give multiple military aid packages to Ukraine. There have been 9 announced so far. It's been roughly $4 billion. And they've gone so far into their own stockpiles of weapons to help the Ukrainians that there is now concern about the U.S. stock levels and ramping up production from defense contractors as to how to replace this.
Right.
But it also doesn't account for the fact that the House has passed a $40 billion military aid package that would help Ukraine. President Biden encouraged them to pass it. The House increased it, and we're now waiting to see how exactly this will play out. But the $40 billion is a huge amount of money, considering the defense budget itself is roughly $700 billion. And we're
Right.
talking about $40 billion just to go to Ukraine.
And the president had only really asked for $33 billion.
Yeah. And so it goes to show that there is support in Congress for providing this money.
Bipartisan support.
Absolutely.
So with all of that, what are we expecting next? I mean, obviously the Senate still has to take up the vote on the Ukraine package, but we can expect that help is probably on the way. Is there anything that they're looking for to see what are the signs of how this is going to go next?
So it all comes back to the Donbass region. And so the U.S. has been training Ukrainians on a number of different weapons that they're providing, whether that's howitzers, whether there's a Phoenix ghost drone that was in development at the time the war started, and the Pentagon actually sort of changed some of its specs just to specifically specify it for Ukrainian needs. And so in addition to all of the technology the U.S. is providing, they're training them, and they're on a number of different weapons. And so it'll be interesting to see how they're able to utilize those weapons. And we've heard a little bit in recent days and weeks of Russians targeting the supply lines as to how the Ukrainians are being able to move this technology throughout the country. And so it'll be interesting to see if the Ukrainians are still able to move the U.S. weapons and weapons from other Western countries throughout the country with ease that they have been.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.